Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Decker, and I'm going to talk to you today about the value and consequences of food processing for food safety, preservation, cost, and waste reduction. First, my disclosures. I have grants from the National Institute of Agriculture, the ARS of USDA, and FOSS Analytics. I also do some consulting with Sensient Technology, the Cranberry Institute, and I give technical advising to Ingenuity Foods. So when we kind of look at ultra-processed foods, we notice that what they are really recommending is that we take agricultural commodities and we either directly cook those at home. So we take something like vegetables and we prepare them and cook them at home and consuming. Or they also recommend that you can use minimally processed foods in this cooking, and that would be things like oil, spices, that would be processed to some extent, but maybe not processed as much as some of the things you see in the grocery store. What their main criticism is this category of processed manufactured foods, which really kind of follows the same trend as what you would have in home cooking, but these are done on large scale. And when you really look at this, you ask, where is the science to be able to say that just because a food is processed in a food processing plant at scale, that it has negative health effects? So to start this conversation, we really need to ask ourselves what processed foods are. And processed foods are defined as any agricultural commodity that has been altered from its natural step. And when we look at the science of food processing, we tend to break food processing down into unit operations. And these are different steps by which the food is processed that cause physical and chemical transformations in the food. So this would be things like heating, heat removal, dehydration, extraction, particle size reduction, separation, and structure formation. So like structure formation of forming the structure of ice cream. So even simple foods like milk often have multiple unit operations. So in milk, we filter it, we separate it, pasteurize it, homogenize it, and package it before it gets to the consumer. Now, in reality, when you go into food plants, if you really look closely, most of the unit operations that are being used in plants are very similar to what we would use at home. And the real big difference is the scale at which they're done. So if you go and look at how bread is made in a factory, it's made very similarly the way you would do it at home. It's just that, as you can see in this picture, that it would just be large volumes of products being made at the same time. The other thing about criticizing processing of foods is that when you look at foods that are ultra processed, like ice cream, bread, sausages, and noodles, they're actually produced by very many different unit operations. So you see in here mixing, homogenizing, fermenting, stuffing, extruding. These are all different unit operations. And it's very hard to scientifically say, why would all these unit operations have a negative impact on health? So I think we really have to start by really critically evaluating whether it's actually the processing that makes a food ultra processed and potentially makes a food to be unhealthy. Now, as I showed you before, these are the two routes that the ultra processing or the NOVA community wants you to prepare your foods. But in reality, a large majority of the foods that we consume are actually coming through this pathway. And some of the reasons why this pathway is so important in the food supply is because these foods can be cheaper. They can take less time to prepare. You don't need to have a lot of cooking skills to make them. And in reality, these foods are actually much more sustainable, in many cases more sustainable than if we were to cook a food at home. They tend to use less energy, and as I showed, they tend to have less waste. Now, when you look at what consumers want in their food products, it's pretty universally agreed that the most important thing for a consumer to purchase a product is whether it tastes good. But other things like the value or the cost is important, the nutrition is important, convenience is important, and more recently, sustainability is really important. So if we look at the value, you can see that the amount of money that we spend on our foods is extremely low. So this is a percentage of our disposable income that we use to purchase foods, either at home, that we prepare at home, or we buy away from home. So this is basically food service. This number has dropped dramatically. If you go back even 50 years previous to this, this number would be much, much higher. And you can see now that we're spending only about 10% of our disposable income on food. This is very important for our economy because we don't have to spend a lot of money on food. We can spend it on lots of other things like iPhones. But it's also very important for our society because it allows people at all different economic levels to have access to food. And this is very important because in the United States, the mean disposable household income is only $56,000. This has a big impact on the type of food we purchase based on our income levels. Now, if you look at why these manufacturers' foods are more affordable and cheaper than what we can buy, what you can make from scratch at home, there's several very important reasons. One is that industries can buy the raw materials in very large quantities so they can get better prices. The equipment that the industry uses is much more energy efficient, so it costs them less energy and less money to produce the food. For instance, when they make tomato paste in industry, they use about 6.6 millijoules per kilogram product. But if you were to do that same thing, it'd be over 3 times more energy you would need to do it at home. The other thing is that they're able to maximize yield to decrease waste. So in other words, if you have a peel a vegetable, for instance, they can peel much more efficiently and have less waste peel. They can take the waste that they do get and make additional products, which helps offset the processing costs. I'll give you some examples of that later. And then they can utilize these processing operations, packaging technologies, and food ingredients to maximize shelf life, which also decreases waste. But we did a little exercise in one of my classes, and when we did tomato paste, an example of tomato paste that you made at home would cost almost $10 a pound, whereas you can go to the grocery store and buy it for about $2 a pound. So this inexpensive source of food is very important for much of the society. And when we really look at what the cost of some of these recommended diets that are out there, they tend to be much more expensive. So for instance, the only real clinical trial for ultra-processed foods, the ultra-processed foods cost $151 per week per person. You look at the Mediterranean diet, the keto diet, the South Beach diet, these again are also quite expensive. And when we look at what people actually spend on food, if you're in the lowest 20% of the income level, you only have $79 a week. If you're in the middle 20%, you're at 144. So maybe you can start to incorporate some of these diets. And then if you're in the highest, you're at $257 a week. So in reality, suggesting that people only eat foods that are not ultra processed, are not made by major manufacturing facilities is out of reach for much of the population. Now, another part that's very important in our food supply is convenience. In 1887, about half of the household labor hours were preparing foods. And this is, and if you look at this, the average American woman spends about 37 minutes in preparation and cleanup. I have women data down here because it's really still women that do most of it in the United States. Non-working women spend more time cooking, about 70 minutes a day. And then you can see part-time and full-time spend less. And then the highest income women spend less, even less than that. This is mostly because they can purchase convenient foods, which tend to be more expensive. So if you try to not have ultra-processed foods in your diet, you're gonna have to spend more time to cook. And this means you're gonna have to sacrifice other things in your life, or it may be very difficult to incorporate your life. So we know that we now have most families have dual working spouses. We have long commuting times. We have a lot of family demands, and we have a lot of needs for quality time. Well, in many cases, this just may not be how you want to spend your time. This might not really fit into your lifestyle if you're going to cook everything from scratch at home. Now, processing for convenience has been around for a long, long time. And a great example of this is wheat. So if you just take wheat kernels and you boil those, this is essentially a non-digestible food, right? So we have to cook it so we can digest it. If you just straight steam or cook, boil wheat kernels, it takes you about 40 minutes to get those into an edible form. This is what's known as farro. If we take that same wheat and we crack it, just by cracking it and increasing surface area, we can decrease that cooking time to 20 minutes. This is cracked wheat. And if we cook and dry that cracked wheat, this is what we call bulgur, and it only takes about 12 minutes. And this process was actually developed about 4,000 years ago. So as you can see that we're spending, an hour or less a day preparing our food, that something like bulgur would be a much more convenient way to incorporate a whole grain, whole wheat product into your diet. So we've developed a lot of technologies over the years to produce these kind of convenient products. And this has been done in a way that they're still affordable. We have blast freezing operations, which can make much higher quality frozen fruits and vegetables than you can do at home. We have aseptic processing. This allows year-round accessibility to things like fruit juice. Also results in very long shelf life, like in almond milk. We have modified atmosphere packaging to preserve meats, pastas, and vegetables, and high pressure processing, which preserves flavor and texture by non-thermal pasteurization. This is what most store guacamole, the way it's processed now. And then another really important thing about the food supply and what consumers want is sustainability. This is really, I think, with concerns about climate change, is a very rapidly growing area. And when we look at the food manufacturing sector, they actually are very, very sustainable. Again, most likely more sustainable than if you would just cook at home. And the reason for this, as I mentioned earlier, they use less energy, they can maximize yields, they can valorize their byproducts. This is often only really practical if you have a lot of byproducts. So you need large quantities. They do a lot of continuous processing. This means that the processing lines are not shut down for days at a time, so they don't have to be cleaned. So if you can clean a processing line every week or every 2 weeks, you're going to use a lot less water than if you're going to be washing dishes at home every day. And then we have a lot of technologies that we can use to maximize shelf life, which also decreases food waste. And food waste is a huge challenge for sustainability. 2019, about 931 metric tons of food was wasted in the United States. Most of that waste comes at the household level, but also happens at food service and in the grocery store. And if Americans could reduce waste by 20%, this could feed 25 million people. So food waste is going to be very important when it comes to trying to feed the world as the population grows. So the food industry can do a lot to help decrease food waste. So for instance, if you go and pick apples, for instance, for the retail market, the only apples that are going to be accepted in the grocery store are the apples that are absolutely perfect. But we know if you've ever gone apple picking, you know there's a lot of non-perfect fruit out there. And that non-perfect fruit could be used to make juices, it can be used to make applesauce, it can be used to make different products without being thrown away. Food processing is also critical to preservation because we have technologies that can inactivate spoilage microorganisms. We have packaging, food additives that can slow microbial growth. We have additives and packaging that can inhibit oxidative rancidity, and we have ways to stabilize colors and flavors. So, if we think about this, then decreasing food waste is really a very important way to increase sustainability. And if we look at some of the unit operations that would do that, something like pasteurization is very important in increasing shelf life. So you can see raw milk only has a shelf life of about 7 to 10 days. If we use what is common to most milk in the grocery store, high temperature, short time pasteurization, 10, 12 to 14 days. Excuse me. And if we ultra pasteurize, which a lot of the milks that we see like dairy, like coffee creamers are processed, this can last over 30 days. We can also use additives that inhibit things like mold growth. And so if you have homemade bread, you probably get a shelf life about 3 to 4 days. If you buy the what's called the ultra processed bread from the grocery store, you're going to about double that shelf life. And this is because these products use both antimicrobial and anti-staling additives. You can also see packaging that increases shelf life. We see this in a lot of meats, which have either oxygen permeable films, modified atmospheres, or vacuum packaging, which increases shelf life. And even in produce now, we see a lot of produce that's being formed like bagged salads, which would be packaged in this packaging that has a lot of tiny holes in it that allows gas to come in and out of the package and control the respiration rates. And then, as I mentioned earlier, high pressure processing, which lets you process fruits and vegetables without heat and destroys the bacteria that would cause their spoilage. We can also decrease waste by utilizing the byproducts. Whey protein is the kind of the model of this. You see whey protein in lots of food products now. Whey proteins were a byproduct of the cheese manufacturing. So cheese is the main protein in cheese is casein. So when you made cheese, you took the casein out and you were left with the whey proteins. And those whey proteins in many cases are now more valuable than the casein itself. A byproduct of grape juice and wine industry would be grape seeds. And you can see grapeseed oil now in many places. And again, the less than perfect avocados that would be harvested can be used to make something like guacamole, but they could also be used to make avocado oils. Dried cranberries, these are not a dried whole cranberry. This is actually a sugar-infused skin, and that is a way to make a new product without having to throw away the skins. And the broccoli slaw, this is actually a product made from the broccoli stems. Again, a product that normally would have been gone to waste is now a usable food product. And then there's also a lot of non-food utilization of byproducts. A lot of technologies now where methane production, methane can be generated from food waste streams. A good example of this is whey permeate. So after they take the whey protein out of the whey, they still have a lot of lactose in there, and they can ferment that lactose into methane and use the methane for energy. There's technologies to recover ethanol from bakeries. When yeast ferments and rises bread, it also produces ethanol, and you could recover that. You can actually, there's a plant that makes breakfast cereals from oats, and they generate so many oat hulls, they can actually burn those for electricity. And then we see things like biodiesel from used vegetable oils, food byproducts as fertilizer. And then if there isn't any other way to recover some value for that food, then you can always use that waste for animal feed. So if you actually start to look at food manufacturing, many of these food manufacturers are have zero food waste. This is just an example of a food additive and its advantages. So if we have something like oxidative acidity and a problem in food, we can use antioxidants as a very effective preservative. And this is just some research from our lab and very simple bulk oil system. And you can see a dramatic increase in shelf life due to the use of the natural antioxidants. So this is important because it can both increase quality, but also increase safety as it's become more evident that lipid oxidation products are bad for your health. So food additives are a very important way to preserve foods and make them more sustainable. There's about 3,000 of them that are approved in the United States. There's a whole host of different types of molecules that are used as food additives. And so it's a little hard to understand why all food additives would be considered bad, because they have such different structural attributes and would be expected to have very different impacts on health. Ultra-processed food criticism has recently focused more on food additives, and especially dietary fibers, non-nutritive sweeteners, and emulsifiers. And they've looked at these and the impact of the microbiome and inflammation. So an example of that is a synthetic acid emulsifier like polysorbate 80 would have this, has been suggested to be less safe than natural emulsifier like this. In reality, all food additives go through pretty rigorous safety testing. And maybe some of these areas like the microbiome and inflammation are something that could have some effects that weren't tested for, but it's really, this research is in its infancy, and it's going to take a long time to understand how any food component impacts the microbiome of the health. So the last thing I want to just talk about is the impact on food purchases and the role of nutrition. And probably more specific to that is this this idea of hyperpalatable foods. And hyperpalatable foods have been suggested to cause people to overeat because they taste so good they can't stop. But the reality is that people have been trying to produce hyperpalatable foods for a long, long time. And they do this, if you think about any restaurant, your goal is to make the best food possible. So this is not something new that's in our diet. Certain combinations of fat, sugar, and salt have been postulated to be hyperpalatable. But the reality is that decades of sensory studies have shown that this hyperpalatability is not consistent across the population. So some people, maybe they would have a certain kind of snack food that they really love and would potentially overeat. Then another person might not be interested in that at all. So well, we recently had a party and I made these shrimp deviled eggs. Deviled eggs are something to me that's very hyper palatable, but there was a lot of people at that party that had no interest in eggs. So this is not a unified phenomenon that certain combinations of food ingredients cause hyperpalatability. So as I mentioned, to mention the processed foods with fat, sugar, and sodium have a long history in the market, and there's been a lot of efforts to try to reduce those food components. The problem that we've had is that there's been several instances of companies trying to reduce these negative nutrients across a whole brand, and this has resulted in a loss of significant sales, which means that product, even if it's healthier, it's not being consumed. And part of this is because the term reduced is viewed negatively by many consumers. So as soon as they would see reduced sodium, reduced sugar, they may just immediately assume that they're not going to taste as good. And so that decreases their sales. And even though there's a lot of these type of products in the market, their sales typically can be very low. So we really need a lot more work and advances in nutrition communications to get consumers to accept these products, because they can potentially taste different than others. And if you're gonna get people to eat healthier diets, they have to pick healthier foods. Now, on the other side of things, we also have to realize that there are a lot of convenient, cheap foods out there that can increase accessibility of low density foods, low nutrient density foods. So these would be like the dessert baking mixes, snack foods, frozen pizza. These are all products that may not have optimum nutritional density. And if you wanted to try to make them at home, if you're only making by scratch, you might not make them very often because they're quite labor intensive. You need a lot of unique and numerous ingredients, and people may not have the skills to make these types of products. So by making these foods more convenient and expensive, this could result in these unhealthy, potentially unhealthy products being more easily acceptable in the daily diet. So, so this really means that people have to be very careful about selection of food into their diet. So in conclusion, processing of food is critical for delivering a food supply that is acceptable and healthy. There's really no strong scientific evidence that processing operations are negatively impact health, especially when you compare that to home cooking. But processing of foods can have a big advantage for a lot of the population because they cost less, they're easier and quicker to make, they're more sustainable than cooking at home, and in some cases you can end up with better nutrition and safety than what you would have at home. Most recently, a lot of the focus on ultra-processed foods is on food additives. It's a little hard to understand how you can make a generalization that any food that contains a food additive is unhealthy, because these additives are so different and wouldn't be expected to all have similar and negative health impacts. And then the other side of that, without using some of these additives, this could cause food safety issues, such as the use of antioxidants in foods that can go rancid. Thank you for your attention, and I appreciate your coming to see our session.
Now that you've heard about food processing from Eric Decker and how it's done, I want to share with you the nutritional perspective. I'm Connie Weaver, and I'm going to talk about the value and consequences of food processing on nutritional value. Here are my disclosures. We are concerned about under and over nutrition in the United States, as we are in most regions around the world. Malnutrition is a serious problem for the working poor, the rural poor, the elderly, homeless, and some children. The prevalence is shown on this heat map, with the darker color being more vulnerable areas. Fresh and local cannot feed the hungry masses. We need to be able to handle large quantities of harvested crops and to be able to store them and distribute them for everyone. But there's a lot of concern these days about processed foods. One study, one of the few randomized controlled trials that has evaluated a processed food diet versus a less processed food diet, fueled the fire of many concerns, showing energy intake increased on this 14-day intervention, where foods were matched in terms of calorie loads and presented to 20 adults in a controlled metabolic unit. but they were free to select the quantities of each of these foods. So the two choices were a highly ultra processed food diet versus a minimally processed diet. And the adults ate more energy throughout the 2 weeks on the ultra processed food. Who knows whether if they had two different diets that improved the taste of the unprocessed diet compared to the ultra processed, it may have been more equal. But these were commonly consumed foods. And no surprise then, if they eat more calories, then they're going to have a positive change in body weight if they're eating the ultra processed food versus unprocessed food. So how do we consider that? We need to make the unprocessed foods or minimally processed foods taste better, as Dr. Decker explained. Right now, the Dietary Guidelines for American Scientific Advisory Committee is evaluating dietary patterns, including ultra-processed foods and its influence on body mass index or body composition. And an article in Advances of Nutrition in Advance says there is little evidence of a relationship between ultra-processed foods and body composition that support any causal mechanisms. The Hall study that I just described is criticized for being too short and having more variables than just the processing extent. This interesting article by Julie Hess and colleagues took commonly consumed American foods and tried to project how well can an ultra-processed foods diet, and this was almost exclusively based on ultra-processed food, fare in terms of the healthy eating index score. And so if you have the best score, it'd be 100 around this radial dial. And it fell short of being perfect. There weren't as many whole grains as recommended, and sodium was too high compared to recommended. But all the other attributes that are recommended on a healthy eating index could be achieved with an ultra-processed diet. It's about the choice. But here is the same radar plot with what the average consumption for Americans is. So you follow the green line and see how far short it is from 100. So maybe our goal shouldn't be worrying about the ultra-processed foods as much as the choices of foods to improve our healthy eating index scores. If you look at the extent of processing on different nutrients, those to recommend and those to recommend to limit by the Dietary Guidelines Committee, a group for a scientific statement for the American Society of Nutrition that I led some years ago found that processing led to or contributed 57% of the energy intake for Americans, and also some other nutrients that the Dietary Guidelines Committee recommends limiting, like 75% of added sugars, which is too much, and 57% of the sodium. But processed foods also contribute 55% of the fiber, 48% of the calcium, 43% of potassium, 34% of vitamin D, and so forth on these essential micronutrients that typically are consumed. Minimal processing creates products that help us achieve a healthy diet, like salad in a bag, baby carrots, dried fruit. And don't forget, some of our most prized staples in the diet are extensively processed, like wheat transformed into bread, or milk transformed into cheese, or olive oil, tofu, for example, wine, ready-to-eat cereals. Adding health attributes to food, as through food fortification, has led to iodization of salt that has greatly decreased goiter incidence. It's contributed greatly to our vitamin D intake because most fluid milk is fortified. Enrichment of flour to the native forms for thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron, and more recently folate, has contributed greatly to the micronutrient intake of those who consume it, and really reduced instances of neural tube defects during pregnancy. Fortification of ready-to-eat cereals, addition of folate to enriched formula, and other bioactives like phytosterols in margarine. If you really look at the effect of certain processing steps that include pretty radical changes like heat treatment or freezing, taking peas for an example, some nutrients are labeled like vitamin C, and there are some losses, but many micronutrients, notably minerals, fiber, and so forth, are little changed. In the process of creating canned foods, often we add more sodium than we probably need to for health. Some people have been concerned about browning process. The Maillard reaction can reduce the limiting amino acids like lysine. So if you look at this browning process and then measure lysine digestibility as an indicator of one of the vulnerable amino acids to such heat processing, this article evaluated lysine digestibility in 20 breakfast cereals, and the range was great, from 53% to 108%. So you cannot generally conclude that this amino acid is destroyed by processing wheat into breakfast cereals. Some nutrient are actually improved by processing. So take lycopene in tomato products. The processed tomato products, like in this figure, shows that sauce, the plasma lycopene from consuming sauce was greatly increased compared to if they got the lycopene through soup or a beverage like V8 juice. I studied calcium bioavailability from a range of dairy products, and it was all similar regardless of the product. So the lactose content, the extent of processing, the solid versus liquid state of it was not affecting calcium absorption. So we determined this by labeling a lactating dairy cow with a stable isotope of calcium, making it into the various dairy products and then feeding it to various populations, and it was equal. A concern about dairy is many subgroups cannot consume the lactose. They have maldigestion problems around much of the world, but there's so many processed milk products now that have removed the lactose that make it available to anyone. I'm currently doing a study in various racial and sex groups using one of these ultra-filtered milk products with zero lactose and not getting any dropouts or refusals to participate because we're using milk and they tolerate it well. Some years ago, we compared calcium absorption from a milk alternative, and that was soy milk, and learned that if the soy milk was enriched with calcium carbonate, it provided equal calcium absorption to cow's milk. If it was fortified with tricalcium phosphate, a little bit less, but still a highly valuable source of calcium. And that study helped lead to the inclusion of this soy beverage as an alternative in the school lunch program. But keep in mind, none of the other milk alternatives, the plant-based beverages, have been tested for calcium bioavailability. So we don't know about any of them except for soy. I want to make a case for nutrient density instead of worrying about the extent of processing. And there is a nutrient-rich foods coalition that is promoting looking at the nutrient value of foods as a positive approach instead of just identifying negative contributions in terms of the constituents to limit, like salt, fat, and sodium. It's not so much whether the fruit and vegetable, for example, is frozen or canned that dictates the nutritional contribution of the food. It's not the extent of processing, it's the value of the nutrient profile. So we can make choices about getting nutrients with reducing calories or extra salt or sugar or fat. Here are a few examples. Extra lean ground patty serving provides 184 calories, but if you have a fatty beef that isn't as lean, it could have 52 more calories from the fat that's saturated. A baked chicken breast might offer 138 calories, but a breaded and fried chicken breast could add an additional 108 calories. Cornflakes that are unsweetened comprise 90 calories per cup, but a frosted version could add additional 57 calories. Choose a baked potato for 117 calories instead of a fried potato that adds 141 calories. Unsweetened applesauce versus a sweetened applesauce, same story. Or full fat milk versus fat-free milk is a huge difference in calorie contribution. And now the manufacturers have offered all sorts of fat levels in between those two. So a nutrient density orientation says choose more low-fat versions of whatever the food product is, rather than the high-fat and high-sugary options, especially if your BMI is above what it's supposed to be. Nevertheless, we should be responsible for our food supply. We can't just completely dismiss the concerns over processed foods that have led to a lot of adverse health conditions because they have increased the calorie intake and sugar and salt. But there is a bright future in processed foods for nutritional related contributions. It's the reason we can think about personalized nutrition. New technologies are available to help us reduce energy intake, reduce salt, preserve freshness, reduce allergens and additives, and promote health in other ways. So healthy eating is a choice. Meeting food guidance depends more on the recipe or nutrient density than the extent of processing. Thank you.